Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today we'll be talking about Parting Glances, directed by Bill Sherwood. That's the second film of the semester for us. So we'll get into the movie. We'll talk about why it's significant in this sort of larger narrative about independent film that we are beginning to learn here. But just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we jump into the film, and we'll also be using John Pearson's chapter today. I asked you guys to read the chapter entitled Parting Glances and the New Queer Cinema. So we'll actually be using that chapter a good bit today because, as we might have already seen, Pearson is actually involved in the distribution of this particular movie. So he can offer some pretty valuable insight, which he doesn't always do that for us every week. Like I said, some weeks he's not actually writing about the movie that we're watching. He does not comment directly on all of our films, but he does have a lot to say about this particular film. So we'll get to all of that in a moment, but just let me say something quickly about the movie screenings. I have heard from most of you, I don't think all of you, but most of you have weighed in. I know some of you have said you're just probably not going to be able to attend the majority of screenings, and that's fine. If you're able to watch the movies independently, like I said last week, that's fine. I don't have to be involved unless you need me to be involved, unless you don't want to have to buy these movies or acquire them yourselves. The screenings are, of course, open to everyone, but I think we will be holding them on Tuesday nights. And I'm sorry for those of you who voted for a different day, but Tuesday is the most popular day. It got the most votes. So we have to go with majority rules. I'm sorry for those of you who that does not work for, but let me know if some of us want another day, and if these screenings work pretty well. We're going to sort of be experimenting this week to see how well these work, and if it proves to be pretty low maintenance and low stress on Tuesday of week 2, I might be willing to have an additional screening day, say maybe on Thursdays, for those of us who might like to attend then. So we'll see. I can't guarantee that, but if things go smoothly and it's easy for me to host these, I can probably do it twice a week. But again, the screenings are only there for those of you who want to attend. Okay, so let's talk about Parting Glances. This movie is a first in many ways. So Pearson talks a lot about this in the chapter. This is the first film, this is the first, theatrically released U.S. film to deal, frankly, with the AIDS crisis during the 1980s. So Sherwood's film is significant for that reason. It's also significant just for the role it plays in this story that Pearson is telling, and I'm kind of telling it with some help from Pearson, this story about independent cinema and its growth, its development throughout the 80s. I mean, we kind of started with Pearson's prehistory back in the 70s, even the 60s with John Cassavetes, and sort of the beginnings of an independent sort of film world that he sort of helped to create by existing outside the Hollywood system. But now we're in the 80s, and Pearson's telling us about this sort of rapid growth and all of these major changes that are happening to the film industry over the course of the 80s, and we'll be talking about some of those today. So the movie factors into that larger narrative, and going back to what Pearson talks about in the chapter, it's really, if not the first, certainly one of the first American movies of any kind, independent or otherwise, to realistically depict the lives of gay men. Like Pearson says in the chapter, there had been certain gay subtexts in previous movies, in films that came out from Hollywood during the golden age of Hollywood cinema, like we were talking about previously, like from the 20s to the 60s, there were gay characters in certain films, and there were certain themes or sort of, hinted at material that could suggest the themes or characters that might relate to non-hetero relationships or sort of alternative sexual identities. But like Pearson says, that stuff always remained on the level of subtext throughout the sort of golden years of Hollywood. There might have been some sort of covert depictions of gay characters. Subtext just mean like underlying themes, underlying ideas that aren't announced. They're not made super clear, but they are there, beneath the surface. So a lot of critics, film historians have done good work going back to some of these older movies and sort of uncovering themes and ideas, lines of dialogue, scenes, moments that suggest this kind of whole hidden meaning that might speak to gay characters and their lives. But that stuff really couldn't be dealt with frankly back in that era. It could not be dealt with really consistently on the surface. And when gay characters did appear, they were often very stereotypical, often sort of caricatures. And as Pearson also mentions, as we get up into the 80s, Hollywood does attempt to portray certain aspects of gay life or certain, alternative identities, but oftentimes those attempts did not exactly pan out. So one example he offers in the chapter is a 1980 film called Cruising, starring Al Pacino, a film that's largely viewed as pretty offensive today, I think, by most members of the LGBTQ community. Just not realistic, and like a lot of other films from that period, mainstream Hollywood films from that period, they often depicted homosexuality or other sort of, LGBTQ identities as being deviant, or being things that characters might need to overcome or sort of wrestle with. And that's where Parting Glances really diverges from a lot of previous precedent, because it's not doing that. The characters in this movie aren't really struggling with their identities, with their sexualities. They've largely seemed to come to a pretty comfortable acceptance of them. And we're just seeing sort of a group of people living pretty routine, regular lives. Lives that would have been recognizable to a lot of heterosexual viewers. So a lot of this stuff seems, maybe obvious to us, or maybe it's sort of painful, or it almost strikes us as ridiculous that we have to point out things like, the gay characters in this movie have regular lives and they have relationship problems and issues with work and all of this other stuff, because to us, I think that's all pretty obvious and we don't really maybe think much of it. But if you go back to the 80s, if you go back to this previous period in American culture and society, obviously AIDS was not really being talked about in the mid-80s. Like Pearson says, there would be some other treatments of the AIDS crisis in TV and film in the years to come, but that stuff would come after Parting Glances, which was released in 1986, so 2 years after Stranger Than Paradise. So we're still in the mid-80s, but obviously we've gone into a different milieu here. We're still in New York City, but we're seeing a side of the city that for a lot of typical movie viewers was going to be different. It's going to be a little bit novel. So the movie's important for that reason, because it's presenting gay characters in a realistic way that really had not been seen much previously. So the film is sort of groundbreaking for that reason. But as Pearson also points out, there had been some other movies that had come out recently that were attempting to sort of depict non-heteronormative perspectives and characters. So he mentions two in particular, one from 1982 called Personal Best, about a track and field athlete who's portrayed as a lesbian. I mean, she does have relationships with women and men in the film, but it's suggested that, her long-lasting, perhaps most vital relationship is with a woman, but then through sort of cultural factors and the politics of her sport and what her coach wants, she's kind of encouraged to pursue a more heteronormative relationship with a man. So that film had come out very recently, starring Mariel Hemingway, who's actually the granddaughter of Ernest Hemingway. Just a little bit of trivia. She was a pretty well-known actress throughout the 80s. And that film was directed by Robert Towne. So like Pearson says, Towne was kind of a Hollywood guy. He made his bones as a screenwriter, perhaps best known for writing the screenplay for Chinatown, directed by Roman Polanski back in the 70s. That was part of that sort of new American cinema. I mean, Polanski was from Poland, I think, but part of that sort of auteur, new American cinema era that we were talking about previously back in the 70s after the fall of the studio system. A lot of sort of new voices, more innovative visions, more violence, more sex, reflecting the counterculture in the U.S. So that movie was very much a part of that. And Towne, like I was saying, like a lot of famous screenwriters, he starts out writing screenplays and then he eventually starts making movies, writing and directing movies of his own. So Personal Best was a film directed by Towne. So, like Pearson says, kind of interesting and maybe noteworthy that two of these early depictions or attempts at sort of wrestling with what we might think of as like LGBTQ themes were both undertaken by straight white guys, one working within Hollywood and the other working outside the system. So Towne is the Hollywood insider. He does Personal Best in 82. And then the very next year in 1983, we have John Sayles, who I mentioned before, sort of one of these godfathers of American independent cinema, another guy that gets his start writing for studio movies, and kind of like Cassavetes, he's able to save money from his Hollywood endeavors to finance his own movies. And he, like Cassavetes, wants to sort of control the distribution of his films. He doesn't necessarily want to sell them and have them go out of his hands. So again, Sayles is looked at as one of these early guys who kind of shows a path forward, to other aspiring indie filmmakers. Hey, you can kind of do this stuff yourself. Of course, again, Sayles and Cassavetes had money. Not everybody is so fortunate, but he's an important kind of figure in the early days of independent film, and he continues to make films throughout the 80s, 90s, into the 2000s. So Pearson mentions him as one of the big three Johns, right? John Cassavetes, John Sayles, and also John Waters, the Baltimore filmmaker who did, Hairspray and Pink Flamingos. We mentioned him as well. Those are three of the godfathers, that kind of got the ball rolling back in the 60s and 70s. So Sayles does a film in 83 called Liana, which also features a main character who is a lesbian, and she's navigating, lesbian relationships. So those films both predate Parting Glances, and they're helping to kind of set the stage for what Pearson sometimes refers to as kind of a new queer cinema. This is part of the legacy of this era, right? I've kind of alluded to this with the explosion of independent film and these new business models that make it possible to make movies outside of Hollywood. Now we have more people able to get a seat at the table. Traditionally oppressed minority groups can now represent themselves and represent their perspectives through the medium of film. There's more opportunities. You don't necessarily have to be inside that studio system. But as we're going to see, it's a great paradox with independent film, right? Movies like Parting Glances start out very, very independent, right? They're basically made at a very far remove from the old studios and that old system that doesn't go away in the 60s. Remember, just because the studios, the era of the studios monopolizing all aspects of film industry, that ends with the antitrust laws and the rise of TV. But like I mentioned last week, the studios don't go away. Like some do. Some of the big eight that used to dominate in the golden era, some of those do go away, but some persist and some remain today. So a lot of them just adapted to the new world, and they were able to eventually get their slice of the pie. So as we're going to see this week, in some ways, this independent boom that Pearson's talking about, it doesn't stay necessarily independent for very long, and Parting Glances will maybe help us to understand that as well. But just getting back to the thematics and sort of the distinctive qualities of this film in particular and how it differs from the movies that came before is the fact that Sherwood is not presenting characters, like I said, who are sort of dealing with or struggling against the straight world. And that's very much kind of what we see in those previous films by Sayles and Robert Towne. The protagonists are struggling. They're struggling for acceptance. They're struggling to navigate a heteronormative world as they realize that they might not fit neatly within these predetermined categories. So a lot of the conflict, a lot of the drama comes from, frankly, the problems that their sexualities present for them. And, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with that type of a story, and it might be expected in these early attempts to sort of depict these types of worlds, these types of lives. But what we see in Sherwood's film, it's just different, right? I mean, the characters just exist in a different way, right? For them, their sexual identities aren't really problems to overcome. They're not really aspects of some larger identity crisis. Like, the characters certainly have problems, right? But the problems don't seem to arise as a direct result of them sort of struggling to find acceptance. There are glimpses of that, right? There are moments of that. When Michael and Robert are having that fight in the back seat of the cab, and the cab driver, says something derogatory kind of under his breath, and Michael hears him, and Michael gets angry. So there kind of are those moments. There's a few moments maybe throughout the film where we can sense that sometimes they maybe have to hide certain things, or maybe they're not always going to be accepted in every scenario. But for the most part, again, this milieu feels different from the milieus that we might have seen in Personal Best or some of these earlier attempts to tackle some of this subject matter. These characters exist in a world where, they seem pretty comfortable, pretty affluent by and large, right? At least the main characters all seem to be doing pretty well. They're all, sort of upwardly mobile. But there's also this specter of AIDS. And it's affecting several of the characters in various ways. So, that's treated with a level of subtlety here. Sherwood doesn't hit us over the head with AIDS messaging, but certainly one of our main characters, Nick, portrayed by Steve Buscemi, an actor that we should recognize, getting his big break here. This is his first big role. So obviously that character is afflicted with the illness, and that's a big driver of the plot. So not everything is going great here in this world that we're observing, but there's just a level of comfort and acceptance within this world that, again, might have, frankly, surprised some heterosexual viewers who had just never really seen that world or been inside that world. Again, it's kind of a unique milieu. It's a little bit unique to New York City, but obviously there were large LGBTQ populations in most major American cities. But now we're trying to realistically portray their lives, not making it into something aberrant or deviant or something that's like an existential problem, right? Just treating them as regular people. So again, that seems maybe obvious to us, but back in the 80s, to normalize these characters was to do a lot, was to make a lot of inroads and progress that I think would help future films, TV, future representation. So it's important for all of those reasons. The cast, I think, is interesting here. A lot like Stranger Than Fiction, we're mostly, Stranger Than Paradise, we're mostly dealing with sort of unknown actors here. Again, Buscemi has clearly become a very famous actor that most of us are familiar with. Like I was saying last week, he was a character actor for a long time, but he's achieved such a level of fame now that maybe we think he's almost a star in his own right. But a lot of people don't realize this was his first major role. He had had a few small parts previously, but this is his first major film role. And a lot of people still walk away from the film to even today thinking Buscemi's performance, might be the best part of the film. He has a lot of charisma, he plays the sort of defiant rock star character, and obviously he has AIDS, so his story is tragic. He seems doomed. But at the same time, he does sort of have a certain vibrant, quality. He still seems like he has a lot to offer. And of course, Michael and Nick have a very close, obviously very complicated and conflicted relationship. But a lot of the drama, a lot of the pathos really derives from that relationship and Michael's relationship with Robert, which is very different in many ways, as we see over the course of the film. So Buscemi obviously goes on to a long and illustrious career. The other leads, not so much. So Richard Ganaung, or Ganaung, I'm not sure how to say his name. I don't know much about him. He has a few other credits. I don't really have a lot of info on him as far as what he did after this movie. He plays Michael, but, Pearson has that fun anecdote talking about when this film opens in Los Angeles. It actually opens at the first multiplex, the first multiplex movie theater in the U.S. I think it's called Beverly Center Cineplex. And at that time, Ganaung was working in that mall or shopping center or whatever it was. He's working in that same facility at a shoe store. His acting career having not really taken off yet. He relocates to L.A. right after shooting in New York is complete. And he ends up walking down to watch himself in the movie because he works very close by at the shoe store. So that's kind of a funny story. But that's Michael. And then Robert is played by John Bolger, who had already been in some TV shows previous to this movie. Pearson mentions that he has soap opera roots or something. I'm not quite sure about that, but Pearson sort of makes the point that Bolger, who was a heterosexual man, according to Pearson, was married with children, sort of distanced himself from the film, didn't go to the premiere, didn't really appear at press events, sort of wanted to distance himself perhaps from the subject matter or the other cast members. I don't know much about that. I don't know much about Bolger, honestly. He did turn up later throughout the 90s and even into the 2000s in some other independent films. He's sort of a New York-based actor. He shows up in a few TV shows that I've seen, like Third Watch. I don't know if any of you watched that back in the early 2000s, and NYPD Blue. He had a couple of guest appearances on those shows, but never became famous, never became a lead, really, in anything, even though, like Pearson says, he kind of has those sort of traditional matinee idol good looks, which are kind of work well for the Robert character. But it's kind of interesting, some of the politics that Pearson mentions, Bolger kind of distancing himself later, and then, of course, Buscemi playing Nick. Pearson offers a little bit of a film review here, a little bit of criticism. He claims that the movie is beautifully structured and edited, and I agree, but he claims that dramatically it's a disappointment. He doesn't offer a ton of rationale for that. He does mention an unresolved ending. So he, acknowledges and I think kind of celebrates that Sherwood is trying to present a realistic representation of this particular milieu. But he says, even if you're trying to be super realistic, you can't get away with that much of an unresolved ending. You have to tie things up and be a little bit more definitive with your conclusion. I don't know if I agree with that, though. I mean, the movie does end in a rather open-ended way, with Nick and Michael on the beach, Nick sort of, we think maybe half playfully, but maybe in earnest, suggesting that they travel somewhere, pick a place, point anywhere, will go. Again, remember, Nick's sort of coming to grips with the fact that he probably will die relatively soon. So this is obviously something that he's wrestling with, as is Michael, as somebody who obviously cares about him a lot. And Robert also seems to care about him, but seems sort of incapable of showing that in a sort of normal way. But that's sort of true of his character, as we observe. There's a consistency there. But yeah, we see Michael and Nick on the beach. We don't really know what's going to happen. It doesn't seem like Nick is in the kind of distress that he was suggesting he was in when he calls Michael and gets him to come out there. So we kind of suspect, and even just seeing him get off the phone, that kind of smirk that we see Nick kind of share with the camera suggests that maybe he just wants Michael's company. Maybe he's sort of just pulling a prank. He seems like a bit of a jokester. Or maybe he really does want to go away, take a trip with Michael, because clearly, like I said, they have a loving relationship. They seem to be very much in love. Michael confesses, to his friend earlier in the film, the friend whose house they go to, was it Joan, I think? He confesses to her that, that Nick is the one that he probably loves the most, and he feels a little guilty because it seems like he's living with Robert. It seems like that relationship might be a little bit more front and center. He's obviously had a long-standing, pre-existing relationship with Nick, and we learn a little bit about it from Nick when he's talking to, Michael's suitor, the young guy at the party, in the stairwell. So they've obviously, Nick and Michael have obviously known each other for a long time and have a long, close, but complicated relationship, because it seems like maybe in some ways Michael has chosen Robert, or maybe chosen a slightly more conventional lifestyle, at least in terms of its outward facing qualities. Robert's sort of a jet-setting employee of an international aid agency. He travels a lot. Seems to have a little bit of rootlessness, a little bit of, wanderlust. So there's all these relationship dynamics that, again, are pretty common to a lot of realistic, dramatic movies about, young people, 20-something, 30-something-year-old people living in big cities, having fun, coupling, figuring out their careers, figuring out their lives. So this is all stuff that's very relatable, for almost any audience. It's not really specialized or unique to any particular group. But certain things are, not necessarily the relationships themselves, but the specter of AIDS was obviously disproportionately affecting gay men, although not exclusively a problem for the gay community in the 80s, particularly when medicine was not caught up yet, and scientists and researchers, doctors didn't necessarily always know what they were dealing with. This was a disease that was disproportionately affecting gay men, particularly in large urban areas like New York or San Francisco. So there is that element that sort of reminds us that we're dealing with some unique qualities, but there's also that universality of the characters, their lives, and their relationships that I think makes the film resonate, and it's allowed the film to kind of find a bigger audience as time goes on. Pearson kind of mentions that when it first came out, it wasn't necessarily a big hit, and it kind of takes a backseat to some other sort of LGBTQ themed movies that came out at around the same time, and we'll get to those. So initially, it's not exactly a resounding success, but it's found more of an audience and maybe kind of gained a little bit more appreciation in the years that have passed since. And Sherwood's an interesting figure just to think about, our director here, because he didn't make any other movies. He died very young of AIDS at the age of 37. So Pearson mentions this. Sherwood initially comes to New York City to study music at Juilliard. He was a very talented violinist, but he eventually leaves music behind and pursues filmmaking. So he did make a few short films and he had a bunch of unproduced screenplays sort of laying around at the time of his death. But this is the only film that he was able to get made, the only full-length feature that he was able to get, made, distributed, and exhibited all three levels of the filmmaking process. So kind of tragic. Sherwood probably would have had a lot of other good stuff in him, a lot of movies if he had, lived longer. But yeah, he died at 37, so this is kind of the only artifact we have from his sort of creative world. But again, he's helping to sort of move move independent film forward, not just in terms of subject matter, but in terms of maybe the business side of things. So Pearson gets into that as well. So the film, in addition to being, funny, I think, observational, kind of has a sharp observational sense. It was obviously made on a small budget, but not quite as small as Stranger Than Paradise. So we mentioned that Jarmusch's movie got made for about $110,000. This movie gets made for about $310,000. So a little bit more expensive to make. We do have some larger crowds, those party scenes. We have a little bit more going on in terms of, the technical side of things, camera shots, setups, a little bit more movement. We don't have quite the same number of really long takes. It's not quite as slow paced as Jarmusch's movie. And like we talked about last week, partly, some of the reasons for that very leisurely pace for Jarmusch is because in some ways it's cheaper. And they didn't have a lot of different scenes, a lot of different set designs or set decorations. A lot of scenes take place either outdoors, on location, or in, a dingy apartment or Aunt Lottie's, living room. So here we have a little bit more diversity. We're in a lot of different apartments. We're in some nice spaces, some nice kind of upscale living spaces. We see a lot of extras. We see maybe more elaborate set design. So a little bit more money being spent during the production phase, but obviously still made on a very small budget. So we get this commentary, this subtle commentary on the AIDS epidemic. That makes the film novel. We've already talked about sort of its larger, sort of unique qualities just in terms of the way it's presenting its subject matter. But again, just to draw a parallel to Stranger Than Paradise, it's again showing us sort of a new side, or what would have been new to many viewers, a new side, a different side of New York City as it was in the 80s. This is a time that's very different from our time, so we can appreciate it on that level, but we can also anticipate these big, sweeping changes that are going to happen in the city. Kind of gets mentioned, I think, by Joan, their artist friend. Again, sort of obliquely. It's subtle, but she mentions her rents going up, right? We get the sense that the sort of artist types that we see inhabiting a lot of these spaces, Nick's an artist. It seems like Michael is at least an aspiring writer. He seems to be finding work mostly as an editor at this point. Again, that's kind of another thing that makes Robert a little different from them, right? He works in sort of a different type of profession. He doesn't seem to kind of have that artistic bent maybe in the same way, but we are getting the sense that for artists, maybe times are beginning to change a little bit in New York City in terms of some of the stuff that we mentioned last week: gentrification, property rates going up, cost of living going up, and the city undergoing some of these changes that we know from our current perspective. But also kind of coming back to Pearson, we can also think about this movie and the role it plays in the continued advancement, development, whatever you want to call it, of sort of the independent movie business model. And Pearson's involved in this, right? So Pearson mentions that he helped to sell Parting Glances to a distribution company. And this gives him a chance to do something that he likes to do, and that is dive into the business side of the movies. And he does that a lot throughout this book. So if you remember, back in the first chapter, Pearson mentioned, we didn't talk about this before, but he mentioned that in the 80s, a lot of those old Hollywood studios that were still in existence began to create sort of arms or branches of their companies that would specialize primarily in foreign and independent films. So in some cases, they were creating distribution companies that would basically just go and find these indies at film festivals, or, they would maybe go to some of these repertory theaters, talk to people in the film world like Pearson, and they would acquire and, buy these movies. In other cases, the studios were creating basically just branches of the studio. They weren't necessarily just distribution companies. They were studios that could jumpstart production. They could produce a lot of the financing, and they might have had a hand in distribution, and in some cases may have even been involved in exhibition. Again, the old way would have been that the studios were handling all of that. But after the fall of the big studio system, the marketplace became fractured. So studios couldn't necessarily control all three levels, production, distribution, and exhibition. But a lot of times they could control, say, maybe production and distribution, or distribution and maybe they're still selling a lot of the movies to movie theaters, or even working with independently owned theater chains. So this is kind of a new innovation, a way that some of these studios are adapting to the new world. They can't control everything, but they can create these sort of subsidiaries, these smaller branches or arms that can sort of tackle the independent film market. So he mentions United Artists as kind of the first studio to really do this. So United Artists was one of the big eight from way back in the day. And then they created a branch or an arm of their company called United Artists Classics. And then that kind of created this new trend where a lot more of these companies were getting created. They were kind of spinning out of arms or branches of the big studios. So he mentions a few of these: Cinecom, Orion Classics, Spectra Film. So these all were sort of existing as distribution companies or just film companies in general, often still owned by larger studios, but in many ways they could operate kind of autonomously. They had a lot of freedom to go out, buy movies, find up-and-coming directors, make deals, enter into negotiation. But this is where things get tricky with our terminology, because as the 80s continue, other studios get in on this. So United Artists was kind of the first, but then 20th Century Fox and Universal and other studios start to set up these kinds of branches, these kinds of arms. In some cases, just distribution companies, in other cases, bigger entities with more power that could go out there and find and buy independent films. So this kind of begs the question, once this starts happening, can we really still consider these films to be independent if they're ultimately being bought and distributed by companies that are ultimately owned by some of these bigger studios? And some people don't really care about that. They don't really care about all the business stuff. And I have to admit that I don't care about the business side as much as I care about the creative side, but it is interesting to consider. And once we get into the 90s and we start dealing with Miramax, which is a company that's very much kind of in the mold of, Cinecom and Orion Classics, these kind of offshoots of the United Artists model that Pearson's talking about in this chapter. I think he even refers to some of these as Miramax before Miramax. And Miramax plays a really outsized role in 1990s independent film. Again, kind of going in, scooping up independent movies that might have been created, shot, produced independently. But don't forget about the other two levels of the movie world. After a movie gets made, it then has to be distributed, and then it has to be exhibited or shown. So Pearson gets in on the distribution side of things here. So he helps to sell this movie to a distribution company. And the company they sell to is Cinecom. So he talks a little bit about this company in particular, and he has a personal relationship with Steve Seifert, who's the publicist of that company, and Seifert was an openly gay man, so he takes an interest in Parting Glances, and he's a big part of how the movie sort of gets purchased and ultimately gets shown to a wider audience. So again, this is Pearson sort of being the insider. I think he knows Seifert from his previous role as director of programming movies at the old Harold Clurman Theater in Manhattan. If you remember way back in the intro chapter, Pearson talks about working at the Clurman Theater. Because remember, he's kind of in on the exhibition side initially, working for some of these old repertory theaters, most of which are gone now, or they don't show movies anymore. The historical ones that might remain, a lot of them don't show movies, at least not regularly. But that's kind of how he gets started, and then he gets in on the distribution side, and then later he becomes a producer. As he will reveal later on, he helps to produce some movies as well. So he has a hand in a lot of different parts of the business. But here, he's giving us some insight into these new kinds of companies like Cinecom, that mostly focus on indies and like European art house films. Because again, there's an audience for this stuff. Like Pearson's talking about when he's starting out in the 70s, there's an audience for these kinds of movies, and the big studios are starting to get wise to that. They're starting to realize, hey, we can make money off of these indies. We can scoop them up. We can buy them for relatively cheap, and then we can give them theatrical releases, work out deals with the exhibition side of things, and this can be just a part of our larger scheme. So that's what's beginning to happen here. But again, I think Pearson views companies like Cinecom as really good. Like, yeah, they kind of spun out of the old studio model, but a lot of them, like Cinecom, sort of operate somewhat independently. They are kind of separate. Some of the ones that were successful, in some cases, again, they could exist maybe completely autonomously, or even if they remained still under the ownership of the larger studio, they still kind of had carte blanche because the regular studio executives might not have been super interested in all of the foreign and indie films that they were hunting down and buying. So they could kind of do their own thing. And they were looking off the beaten path. They were looking for stuff like Stranger Than Paradise and Parting Glances, stuff that the big studios in previous eras would have overlooked, would have rejected. And Pearson gives us some insight about that. So, initially they try to play hardball with Cinecom. They're like, all right, we might sell it to you, but we're going to look around at some other offers. We think we can get a little bit more money for it. So they shop it around to some other companies like Orion Classics, and they get rejected. And of course, Pearson accounts for this in a pretty obvious way. He says a lot of it was just homophobia and the fact that back in the 80s, a lot of people thought this kind of movie wouldn't sell. People say that to Pearson. There's no crossover appeal. There's no market for this kind of movie. Heterosexual viewers aren't going to want to watch this kind of movie. Unfortunately, I don't think that mindset is completely gone from the film industry. I think some people, some executives might even feel that way, but we've certainly come a long way in terms of representation, getting different kinds of characters on screen, and I think audiences' comfort level, generally speaking, has also steadily increased since the mid-'80s. But we can understand why this was a little bit of a struggle back in, 85 when they're trying to get this movie out. So eventually they go back to Cinecom, and I think they accept that original offer because that ultimately was the best that they were going to be able to get. But again, kind of modest beginnings here. The movie was cheap. It didn't gross a whole lot. It wasn't really a smash hit upon its release, but Pearson tries to explain that by mentioning these other films that came out, I believe, in the same year or maybe 1 year prior. I'm getting my years a little bit mixed up, but right before Parting Glances comes out, we have two other films that Pearson mentions. One called Desert Hearts, directed by Donna Deitch, or Deitch. And the other one is from Stephen Frears, who's a British director, called My Beautiful Laundrette. You might have heard of that one because it stars Daniel Day-Lewis, one of his early breakthrough performances. So those movies both come out at around the same time as Parting Glances. And again, they both involve LGBTQ characters and themes, and they're both, frankly, more popular upon their initial release. So like Pearson says, out of this group of three, and again, maybe we don't really want to group these movies together just because they're all featuring gay characters in sort of these types of milieus, but that's the way they were classified in the 80s, certainly, and in some ways they might still be classified this way. Out of these three, according to Pearson, Parting Glances was kind of the third in terms of its evaluation, the way critics and viewers responded. It didn't get a ton of great reviews, some lukewarm reviews, a few negative ones, some good ones, but it's really kind of risen in people's estimation, like I said, since then. Initially, the acting got beat up a little bit. Outside of Buscemi, some critics said the other actors maybe weren't all that good. Some people claimed the screenplay maybe lacked direction. Again, I think that's a little bit of an unfair charge or just an inaccurate one. Again, with these, for me, this is just my own personal opinion. You guys are free to disagree. But for me, a slice of life realism doesn't always invite a lot of resolution or even a lot of clear direction. These people are just living their lives, right? And we do have conflict. Things do change. Things do happen. We have sort of an open-ended resolution that bothers some people, doesn't bother others. But in the years since, people have really come to appreciate not just Buscemi's acting, but I actually think Bolger's really good as Robert. A lot of people think Michael has a kind of sweet charisma, but he can also be sort of biting and sarcastic. So, a complex character. I think they all kind of pull off their roles well. There's some good, smaller supporting roles that I think work well. Thought the party scene was really well done, well staged, amusing. There's real emotion there as well. He's able, Sherwood is kind of a deft storyteller. I think I think he would have had a bright future. He has a nice sense of pacing. I think he does a good job with character development. I think it's a very entertaining, sort of fast-moving story that, again, presents life and people as they are, which sometimes means that we're defying certain dramatic conventions. I think Pearson's a little bit of a traditionalist when it comes to what he expects from a plot and the kind of payoff he wants thematically at the end. We don't necessarily get all of that, but we do get a lot of, I think, authentic representations of New York, these characters, the lives they lead, the problems that they are facing. Again, it's kind of a frank, clear-eyed portrayal of what they're going through, but there's still a lot of subtlety and humor and a lot of life and a lot of happiness in the midst of the obvious tragedy and difficulties. So I think it's a pretty significant artistic achievement, but Pearson seems to focus more on how it kind of signals this new way that independent movies can get discovered and purchased and distributed and shown to pretty big audiences. Increasingly, the studios are involved, but kind of at a remove. And then there are figures like Seifert and companies like Cinecom that can kind of branch out and do their own thing. But a lot of people are going to claim that we weren't outside of the studio system for long. We've kind of moved back, at least adjacent to, if not back inside. We're at least very close to that system. But there is still autonomy, and there's an increased interest in indie movies. And that seems to be the silver lining and really the most important thing, perhaps, for Pearson. So he claims that this movie really helps him to see the possibilities of this, what he calls this kind of new queer cinema. There is an audience. There is crossover potential with a movie like this, where, again, the characters are presented as just very normal, right? Just very normal people that I think almost anyone could relate to. And I mean normal in all of its complexity, right? Everybody's normal in their own way, but, we can, I think a lot of audiences can see themselves in these characters, but we're also forced to confront a very real crisis that didn't have any easy answers or solutions in the mid-'80s. I think the way Sherwood does that is very sort of artful, very graceful, but still kind of profound. So Pearson sees again, as sort of a businessman, he sees the possibilities of, more LGBTQ themed movies, and he himself gets involved in producing Go Fish, which is directed by Rose Troche and depicts the lives of a group of lesbian characters, and we're going to be watching that movie later this semester. So we'll be talking about Pearson's role in that film as well. But the final thing he sort of throws in at the end of the chapter, I think, is significant for us to consider. He says right around the time that they're selling Parting Glances to Cinecom, something else happens in the middle of the 80s, another very momentous occasion, and that is the first Blockbuster video rental store opens in Dallas, Texas. So he just mentions that, he throws it in, but we should remember that the dawn of Blockbuster and home video would profoundly change the movie industry, as we've already mentioned. So Pearson's just doing a little bit of, foreshadowing here. He's just kind of mentioning this other big change that we're going to be talking about and dealing with more as we move along. So just another reminder that here in the mid-'80s, there's all this new possibility, these new sort of avenues for films to get made and distributed and shown. A lot's happening, a lot's changing, even culturally in some ways. But at the same time, there's even bigger change, especially on the business side, right around the corner. So we'll talk more about that later. That's it for this week. So like I said, let's try our first movie screening this week. I am sorry that we weren't able to do one back in week 1, but it sounds like most of you were able to watch Jarmusch anyway. So let's try our first screening on Tuesday, February 1st. It seems appropriate, the first day of a new month. We're going to try to start a new thing. So I will invite everybody in the class to a Zoom meeting. Those of you who want to attend. Those of you who don't, you can disregard that email or that invite. And then once everybody's there, I'll try to share my screen and play the film. We'll see how it goes. I look forward to it. I'll see some of you later this week. I'll see the rest of you next week for the week 3 lecture.